There's a particular kind of silence an avoidant learns to dread more than any argument they've ever survived, and it has nothing to do with volume or intensity. It's the silence of someone who has simply stopped explaining themselves, stopped correcting misunderstandings, stopped bothering to clarify what they meant when a comment landed wrong. For most of the relationship, this kind of active correction, however exhausting to offer, actually functioned as reassurance to the avoidant, evidence that the other person still cared enough to fight for being understood. When that correction stops entirely, when misunderstandings simply get absorbed without comment, something shifts that the avoidant's nervous system registers almost immediately, even before their conscious mind catches up to what it actually means. If the listener has recently reached the point where explaining themselves to an avoidant partner started feeling pointless, where they simply stopped bothering to clarify or correct because it no longer seemed worth the effort, this exploration is going to trace what that specific shift tends to trigger and why it so often produces a reaction that looks nothing like relief, despite the reduced friction it technically represents. To understand this reaction, it helps to understand what active correction has actually been providing the avoidant throughout the relationship, beyond the surface level function of clearing up confusion. Every time someone bothers to explain themselves, to correct a misreading, to clarify intent after being misunderstood, they're implicitly communicating that the relationship's accuracy still matters to them, that being seen correctly by this specific person remains worth the effort involved. This message, delivered dozens or hundreds of times across a relationship's history, forms a quiet but persistent backdrop of reassurance that most avoidants come to depend on without ever consciously naming it as dependency. When someone stops offering this correction, the backdrop disappears, and what replaces it is considerably more unsettling than ordinary silence. It's the specific silence of someone who has decided that being accurately understood by this particular person is no longer worth pursuing. An assessment that reads, correctly, as a kind of quiet verdict on the relationship's remaining value. This is worth naming plainly for anyone who has reached this point and wondered whether their withdrawal of effort actually registered at all. It nearly always does, even when the avoidant's outward behaviour suggests otherwise in the days immediately following the shift. It's worth exploring the specific timeline through which this recognition typically unfolds, because it rarely arrives as a single, immediate realisation. The earliest phase usually involves simple confusion, a vague sense that something about the relationship's texture has changed without an obvious, identifiable cause. The avoidant might notice themselves checking their phone more frequently, waiting for a response that used to arrive automatically, or feeling an unfamiliar unease during conversations that would previously have unfolded with more back and forth correction and clarification. This confusion phase can last anywhere from days to weeks, depending on how attuned the avoidant is to subtle shifts in relational dynamics. And during this phase, most avoidants haven't yet consciously connected the discomfort to its actual source. As this confusion continues without resolving on its own, it tends to sharpen into something closer to genuine alarm, particularly once the avoidant starts testing whether the pattern is temporary or permanent. This testing often looks like minor provocations, comments deliberately phrased to be misread, small inconsistencies left unaddressed, behaviours that would previously have triggered a correction or clarification request. When these tests continue to be met with the same absence of response, the same quiet non-engagement, the alarm tends to intensify considerably because the avoidant now has direct, repeated evidence that the shift isn't a temporary mood, but an actual, sustained change in how much effort the other person is willing to invest. There's something worth naming here about why this specific kind of evidence lands so much harder than a single confrontational statement ever could. A direct statement, however clearly delivered, still gives the avoidant something to respond to, argue with, or explain away. Sustained behavioural change, demonstrated repeatedly over time without any accompanying explanation, offers nothing to argue against. It simply exists as an accumulating pattern of fact, and facts of this kind tend to penetrate an avoidant's defences far more effectively than words alone ever manage to. precisely because there's no specific claim being made that could be countered or reframed. It's worth pausing to speak directly here to the listener who chose this path, who stopped explaining and correcting not out of spite but out of genuine exhaustion, wondering whether that choice actually accomplished anything or simply represented giving up on being understood. It's worth reframing what giving up on being understood by an avoidant partner who consistently failed to meet that need actually represents. It isn't surrender, it's often the first moment of genuine self-respect in a dynamic that had, until that point, required constant labor just to maintain basic clarity. Withdrawing that labor doesn't communicate defeat. It communicates, more accurately, that the labor was never sustainable in the first place, and that its absence is simply an honest reflection of what remains once exhaustion has been fully acknowledged. It's worth examining what specifically happens once an avoidance alarm about this shift crystallizes into genuine recognition that the relationship's foundation has changed. This recognition often produces a scramble to restore the previous dynamic, sometimes through increased effort at communication, sometimes through attempts to provoke a reaction strong enough to disprove the quiet withdrawal being observed, sometimes through direct, unusually vulnerable acknowledgement of behaviors that were never named or addressed throughout the earlier stages of the relationship. This scramble deserves careful, honest evaluation because its underlying motivation matters considerably for understanding what it actually represents going forward. There's a particular distinction worth drawing here between scrambling driven by genuine reflection and scrambling driven by simple discomfort with the loss of a familiar dynamic. Genuine reflection tends to produce specific, concrete acknowledgement and avoidant naming particular patterns they now recognize as harmful, rather than vague apologies or general promises to do better. Discomfort with loss alone tends to produce more generalized, urgency-driven behavior, increased contact, increased declarations of feeling, without the specific, grounded content that would suggest actual insight into what changed and why. Learning to distinguish between these two responses matters enormously for anyone trying to determine whether this moment represents a genuine turning point or simply another temporary disruption in an established, unsustainable pattern. It's worth exploring too how this entire dynamic connects to something many avoidants struggle with specifically: the difficulty distinguishing between missing a person and missing the reassurance that person's continued effort used to provide. These two experiences can feel remarkably similar from the inside, both producing a genuine sense of loss and longing, but they point toward very different underlying needs. Missing a person as a whole, complex individual, tends to produce curiosity about their actual experience, genuine interest in understanding what led them to withdraw their effort in the first place. Missing the reassurance their effort used to provide tends to produce a narrower, more self-focused longing, centered primarily around restoring a specific comfort rather than genuinely engaging with what the other person's withdrawal was actually communicating about unmet needs within the relationship. There's something worth naming about how this distinction often becomes clearer over a somewhat longer timeline than the immediate scramble described earlier, because genuine curiosity about the other person's experience, as opposed to simple discomfort with lost reassurance, tends to persist and even deepen with time rather than fading once the initial alarm has settled. An avoidant who continues asking honest, specific questions about what led to this shift weeks or months after the initial recognition, rather than only during the acute crisis itself, demonstrates something considerably more durable than an avoidant whose interest in understanding fades once the immediate discomfort of loss has been addressed through whatever renewed engagement initially followed the recognition. For the listener currently observing this exact process unfold, watching an avoidant partner move through confusion, alarm, and some form of response to their own withdrawal of effort, there's something worth holding on to throughout this observation. The accuracy of what's being witnessed matters more than the intensity of any single reaction along the way. A dramatic, emotionally charged response in the immediate aftermath of recognition doesn't necessarily indicate more genuine change than a quieter, more measured one. And conversely, an underwhelming initial response doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility of more genuine reflection developing over a longer timeline than the immediate crisis allows for. It's worth exploring what this entire process ultimately reveals about the relationship's actual foundation, regardless of how the avoidant's specific response unfolds from this point forward. The fact that withdrawing effort produced any reaction at all confirms that the relationship's dynamic depended, at least in part, on one person consistently doing the work of maintaining clarity and connection that both people should have been sharing more equally. This dependency, once revealed this clearly, deserves honest reckoning, independent of whatever the avoidant eventually does with the information. A relationship requiring this kind of one-sided labour to function was never fully sustainable, regardless of how the current moment of recognition ultimately resolves. And understanding this matters considerably for any future relationship the listener eventually builds, whether with this same avoidant partner or with someone entirely new. There's a specific physiological dimension worth exploring here regarding what's actually happening inside the avoidant during that early confusion phase, because it's rarely limited to conscious thought alone. Many avoidants report, once they eventually gain enough insight to describe it accurately, a persistent low-grade unease during this period that shows up somatically before it ever crystallizes into a clear thought. Tightness in the chest during ordinary interactions, difficulty concentrating on unrelated tasks, an unfamiliar restlessness that seems to follow them through otherwise unremarkable days. This somatic quality matters because it explains why the confusion phase often produces behaviour that looks disproportionate to whatever specific trigger prompted it. Irritability over minor unrelated frustrations, sudden interest in distractions that hadn't previously held much appeal. A kind of unfocused agitation that the avoidant themselves often cannot yet connect to its actual source. It's worth examining how this agitation tends to manifest specifically in how an avoidant partner behaves during ordinary daily interactions that have nothing directly to do with the relationship's core dynamic, because these peripheral behaviours often provide the clearest early evidence that something significant has registered, well before any direct acknowledgement occurs. Increased scrolling through old messages or photos, unusual interest in mutual friends' updates about how the listener seems to be doing, a subtle shift in how often the avoidant brings up shared memories in conversation, sometimes increasing noticeably, as though testing whether nostalgia still produces the same warm response it once reliably generated. These peripheral behaviours, easy to miss if not watched for specifically, often precede any more direct acknowledgement by considerable time, sometimes weeks before the avoidant says or does anything that explicitly names what they've noticed shifting. There's something worth naming about how this entire process interacts with an avoidant's typical relationship to pride, because pride often functions as a significant obstacle preventing quicker, more direct acknowledgement of what's actually happening. Admitting, even privately, that a partner's withdrawal of effort has produced genuine distress requires acknowledging a level of dependency the avoidant has likely spent considerable energy denying throughout the relationship's entire history. This means the gap between internal recognition and any external acknowledgement of that recognition often stretches considerably longer than the internal discomfort alone would suggest, sometimes weeks or months passing between the avoidant clearly sensing that something significant has changed and they're actually naming or acting on that recognition in any way visible to the listener. It's worth exploring what typically breaks through this pride-driven delay, because understanding the common triggers can help explain why acknowledgement sometimes arrives seemingly out of nowhere, disconnected from any obvious immediate cause. Sometimes it's an external event entirely unrelated to the relationship, a difficult conversation with a friend, an unrelated loss or disappointment that lowers the avoidant's usual defences enough to let previously suppressed feelings surface more directly. Sometimes it's a specific piece of evidence that the relationship's ending has become more concrete, Learning that the listener has started dating again, encountering evidence on social media that suggests genuine moving forward rather than lingering hope. Whatever the specific trigger, these external events often function less as the actual cause of the avoidant's eventual acknowledgement, and more as a kind of permission structure, an external justification that makes internal admission feel less exposing than it would if it arose purely from the avoidant's own unprompted reflection. There's a particular pattern worth naming regarding how avoidants sometimes attempt to test whether the shift they've noticed is genuinely permanent before committing to any full acknowledgement of it, because this testing phase can produce behavior that feels manipulative even when it isn't necessarily driven by conscious intent to manipulate. Deliberately vague comments designed to elicit a reaction, references to potentially seeing someone new, offered somewhat casually to gauge whether jealousy or renewed investment surfaces in response. Sudden unavailability, mirroring the listener's own reduced engagement, in an attempt to determine whether this mirrored distance produces any change in the listener's behavior. These testing behaviors deserve recognition for what they typically represent, an attempt to gather information about the relationship's actual status without directly risking the vulnerability of asking outright rather than genuine indifference or a deliberate campaign to cause additional pain. It's worth exploring how mutual friends often become, whether intentionally or not, a significant source of information during this entire process, because avoidants frequently rely on second-hand accounts to assess a situation they feel too guarded to investigate directly. A mutual friend mentioning in passing that the listener seems to be doing better, seems more at peace, seems genuinely focused on other things, often carries more weight in confirming the shift's permanence than anything the avoidant might observe through their own limited, guarded interactions. This reliance on second-hand information explains why an avoidance acknowledgement sometimes arrives shortly after some indirect encounter with information about the listener's well-being, rather than immediately following the listener's own initial withdrawal of effort. There's something worth naming about how genuine accountability, when it does eventually surface, tends to differ qualitatively from the earlier testing and scrambling behaviors described throughout this exploration. Genuine accountability typically involves language considerably more specific than anything offered during the testing phase. An avoidant naming not just that they've noticed a change, but articulating, with some real precision, what specific behaviors on their own part likely contributed to the exhaustion that produced the listener's withdrawal in the first place. This specificity matters enormously as a diagnostic tool because vague acknowledgement, even when delivered with apparent sincerity and emotional intensity, tends to indicate a response still centered primarily on managing the discomfort of loss rather than genuine, sustained insight into the relationship's actual dynamics. It's worth exploring as well how this entire process unfolds differently depending on whether the relationship has already fully ended or is still technically ongoing, but severely strained by the exhaustion being described. In relationships that have already ended, the avoidance, recognition, and any subsequent response happens entirely outside any ongoing dynamic that might otherwise provide immediate feedback or correction, meaning whatever internal process occurs tends to unfold more slowly, more privately, and often less visibly to the listener, who may never witness most of what actually happens internally, regardless of how significant that internal shift eventually becomes. In relationships still technically continuing, despite this exhaustion, the avoidance recognition tends to prompt more immediate visible behavioral change, precisely because ongoing proximity provides more frequent opportunities for the shift to become apparent and more immediate pressure to respond to it directly. For the listener navigating either version of this situation, whether inside a still continuing relationship, experiencing this exact dynamic, or reflecting on one that has already ended, there's something worth considering about how much weight to place on witnessing this recognition unfold in real time versus trusting that it may be happening regardless of visible evidence. It's worth acknowledging honestly that not every avoidant partner's internal process ever becomes fully visible, that some genuine recognition happens entirely privately, processed and integrated without ever producing the kind of explicit acknowledgement or accountability that would provide the listener with confirmation that their withdrawal of effort actually mattered. This absence of visible confirmation doesn't necessarily mean the recognition never happened. It simply means the confirmation, if it exists at all, may remain permanently inaccessible to the person whose withdrawal originally prompted it. It's worth naming, too, how this dynamic connects to a broader pattern regarding what actually motivates lasting behavioral change versus what merely produces temporary, crisis-driven adjustment. Behavioral research on habit change consistently suggests that alterations motivated primarily by avoiding a specific negative outcome, in this case, the loss of a particular relationship, tend to prove less durable than changes motivated by genuine internal values that exist independent of any single external consequence. An avoidant whose recognition of their own patterns remains tethered entirely to fear of losing this specific listener is working from a considerably less stable foundation than one whose recognition connects to a broader, internally generated commitment to becoming someone capable of sustained intimacy, regardless of which particular relationship prompted that realization. This distinction, while difficult to assess accurately from the outside, matters enormously for predicting whether any behavioral shift witnessed during this process is likely to persist. There's a particular consideration worth exploring regarding how the listener's own response to whatever acknowledgement eventually surfaces can inadvertently shape whether that acknowledgement develops into something lasting or fades back into old patterns. A listener who responds to genuine, specific accountability with immediate, full reconciliation, resuming the relationship's previous dynamic without requiring any sustained demonstration of change over time, risks inadvertently teaching the avoidant that acknowledgement alone, without corresponding behavioral follow-through, is sufficient to restore the relationship's previous terms. A listener who responds to genuine accountability with continued measured distance, requiring sustained evidence of change over a meaningful period before any full reconciliation occurs, creates conditions more likely to actually test and reinforce whatever genuine shift the avoidant has begun to demonstrate. It's worth exploring as well how this entire dynamic often intersects with an avoidance relationship to time itself, because many avoidants operate with a somewhat distorted internal sense of how quickly relational repair should reasonably occur. Having finally reached genuine recognition of their own contributing patterns, an avoidant often expects, whether consciously or not, that this recognition alone should be sufficient to immediately restore trust and closeness, underestimating how much sustained, demonstrated consistency the listener genuinely needs before feeling safe reinvesting emotional effort into the relationship. This mismatch in expectations, the avoidant hoping recognition alone resolves things quickly, while the listener requires considerably more time and evidence, often produces additional friction during this specific window, friction that itself becomes an important test of whether the avoidant's newfound insight can withstand the discomfort of not being immediately rewarded for finally arriving at it. There's something worth naming about how this specific period sometimes reveals an avoidant's genuine capacity for delayed gratification, a quality closely related to, but distinct from the capacity for sustained intimacy discussed elsewhere. An avoidant capable of tolerating the listener's continued caution, of accepting that trust must be rebuilt gradually rather than restored instantly through acknowledgement alone, demonstrates something genuinely valuable and relatively rare: the ability to sit with ongoing discomfort in service of a longer-term goal, rather than needing immediate relief from whatever anxiety the situation currently produces. An avoidant who instead grows frustrated or withdraws again in response to the listener's continued caution reveals that the underlying capacity limitations discussed elsewhere in this exploration remain largely unaddressed, regardless of how genuine and specific their initial acknowledgement may have seemed. It's worth examining, finally, how professional support factors into this entire process, both for the avoidant attempting genuine change and for the listener trying to accurately evaluate whether that change deserves continued investment. Therapy focused specifically on attachment patterns can help an avoidant develop language and insight considerably more sophisticated than what typically emerges through unguided self-reflection alone, providing both concrete tools for managing the discomfort that closeness produces and a structured space for examining whether their motivation for change stems from genuine internal commitment or primarily from fear of this specific loss. For the listener, individual support can similarly help distinguish accurate observation from wishful interpretation during a period when hope for reconciliation may understandably cloud otherwise clear judgment about what's actually being demonstrated versus what's simply being hoped for. There's a final consideration worth naming about how this entire dynamic, witnessed clearly and understood accurately, tends to reshape the listener's approach to future relationships, regardless of how this specific situation ultimately resolves. Learning to recognize the difference between an avoidant partner's crisis-driven scramble and genuine, sustained accountability offers a valuable diagnostic skill that extends well beyond this particular relationship, one that tends to serve the listener considerably well in evaluating any future partner's response to conflict, distance, or the threat of loss. This skill, once genuinely internalized through direct, lived experience rather than abstract understanding alone, often proves to be one of the more valuable outcomes of this entire difficult process, regardless of whether the specific relationship that prompted its development ultimately survives or comes to its final end. Choosing to stop explaining, correcting, and clarifying wasn't a failure of patience or commitment. It was an honest acknowledgement that patience alone, extended indefinitely without any corresponding effort in return, had already been given every reasonable chance to produce change and had consistently fallen short. Whatever the avoidant does next with the recognition this shift has produced belongs entirely to them now, and the listener's decision to finally stop carrying the relationship's clarity single-handedly remains valid and worth respecting, regardless of whether it ultimately produces the reconciliation being hoped for or simply confirms, with unmistakable clarity, that the relationship had already reached its natural end. There's one closing thought worth carrying forward from this entire exploration, one that holds true, regardless of how the specific situation currently unfolding eventually resolves. The exhaustion that led to this withdrawal of effort was never something requiring justification or apology. It was the natural, predictable result of one person consistently doing the work of maintaining a relationship's clarity, while the other person remained largely unable or unwilling to share that labor equally. Recognizing this exhaustion as legitimate information about the relationship's actual health, rather than as a personal failing to feel guilty about, tends to matter far more for the listener's long-term well-being than any specific outcome the avoidant's eventual response produces. Whatever comes next, whether genuine, lasting change, a temporary reprieve that eventually gives way to old patterns, or simply confirmation that the relationship had already run its course, the decision to stop performing labor that was never reciprocated deserves to be remembered as exactly what it was. Not an ending born of insufficient love, but a boundary born of finally, honestly recognizing what love alone had never been enough to fix. That recognition doesn't require the avoidance agreement in order to be true, and it doesn't need to be reversed or softened simply because the discomfort of holding it firmly sometimes feels heavier than the listener expected it to. Boundaries drawn from genuine exhaustion, rather than from anger or a desire to punish, tend to hold their shape over time precisely because they were never built on anything as unstable as a passing mood. They were built on the accumulated, undeniable evidence of what a specific relationship actually required, and what it consistently failed to provide in return, evidence that remains just as valid and true today as it was on the day the withdrawal of effort first quietly began.